Welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and this week's presentation is what is the true definition of the Torah, and what is the true definition of the testimony, and why do you need to know? Now, for full disclosure, we actually started out this presentation because we were trying to do a different presentation. We wanted to talk about something really important, and that's the vital necessity of hearing and obeying Yahweh's voice, which is something that's commanded for all disciples. And what we realized is that there's really no way to understand the importance, the vital, critical importance of hearing Yahweh's voice in context unless we understand the big picture scenario of the Torah and the testimony. So in order that we can understand next week's critical lesson on how to hear and obey Yahweh's voice, this week we need to talk about the Torah and the testimony. We got a two-part micro series. First part, we're going to talk about what is the true definition of the Torah, because most people who say the word Torah really don't know. And that's because most people have derived their definition from the Orthodox. And as we see at the end of this presentation, well, to put it nicely, the Orthodox still have a veil over their eyes. So their definition is incorrect. Most Messianics have inherited that definition. Most Ephraimites and two-house believers also have inherited this wrong definition of what is Torah from our Orthodox brethren. So none of them know, and this is something that we need to know. We're going to see in the next slide. We're also going to talk about why is there more than one Torah? And a lot of people are going to say, what are you talking about? More than one Torah? Oh yes, there's more than one Torah. And we're going to talk about the relationship between these different Torot, which is plural. Don't say Torahs. It's Torot. It's a feminine plural. What is the relationship between these different Torot and the testimony or the manifestation of Yahweh's Spirit? And we're going to do all this in preparation for an extremely important subject next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the vital, critical, crucial importance of hearing Yahweh's voice. So next week, we're going to talk about what is the true definition of the testimony. We're also going to talk about the relationship between the testimony, which is a manifestation of the Spirit and Yahweh's voice. We're also going to talk about how can we hear Yahweh's voice. So we're going to jump right in. In Yeshayahu, or Isaiah, chapter 8 and verse 20, Yahweh says, "To the Torah and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, it is because there is no light in them." Now we look this word light up. It's Strong's Hebrew 7837. It's shahar, meaning morning dawn or daybreak. So in context, what Yahweh is really saying here is, if they don't know the true definition of the Torah, and if they can't manifest the testimony, it's because the daylight hasn't dawned on them yet. They're still in darkness. It's like the blind leading the blind. Everyone's going to fall into a pit. Better leave them alone. So this is something to think about the next time you're shopping for a Torah teacher, or if you're deciding which ministries to pay attention to. If someone doesn't know or doesn't teach according to the true definition of the Torah, or if he doesn't manifest the testimony of Yeshua, time to leave him alone. Now, the testimony, most people use the term testimony. They refer to this as their story about how they got saved. They tell the story about what Yeshua means to them and how they got saved. And that's part of the testimony. But what the testimony truly is how we manifest Elohim's Spirit, or in our case, how we manifest Yeshua's Spirit. That's the true definition of a testimony. Now, the term Torah is oftentimes translated as law, as in the laws of Moses. And what it actually means is instructions. Now, the term law is not a bad translation because the Father's instructions, the King of the universe, his instructions do carry the weight of law. And the Torah does have commandments, statutes, judgments, and ordinances and laws. But most of all, this is the point that most people miss. Most people don't understand that what the Torah really is all about is that Elohim is trying to pass along his precepts to us. And people say, well, what is a precept? Okay, a precept, we can think about it perhaps like a concept. Now, Elohim's concepts is that we should be valiant, we should be righteous, we should be just, we should have love and compassion, we should have mercy, we should be long-suffering, we should be hardworking, we should do the right things, we should be righteous people. But an even bigger construct is the need to establish Yeshua's ordered kingdom, because that's the point of the whole exercise, is to bring the earth into subjection to Yeshua and to establish Yeshua's ordered kingdom. That's what the scriptures truly speak of. So all of these are precepts. So anything that works in favor of these precepts. Now, in the book Torah Government, we talk about the progression of priestly Torot. Again, don't say Torahs, say Torot. It's a feminine plural. But it's important to understand that the Torah, the big picture Torah, is Yahweh's instruction to his people, because Yahweh is growing something. He's growing a kingdom for his son. And there's a very important, very interesting sequence that he's following for this. And if you read the book Torah Government, you will understand the main battle plan, so to speak. You'll understand what Elohim is attempting to do and why have we been through this specific sequence of priesthoods, and what does it mean for us today. So the first thing that we see in the book is that there was, first, you might say that Israel was under an internal patriarchal priesthood. What does that mean? That means that the father of the house also served as the priest of his household. So, for example, Noah, when he got off the ark and was delivered safely, he offered up sacrificial offerings to Yahweh. Then by the time of Abraham, we had an external Melchizedekian order. So Melchizedek was not part of Abraham's lineage. He was external to the future nation of Israel, so to speak. So we had an external Melchizedekian order. Then Israel went down into slavery in Egypt for 430 years. And in a sense, they were under the covering, so to speak, of the Egyptian priests. It's a terrible thing. But then when Yahweh brought Israel out of Egypt, he established first an internal priesthood of the firstborn. And he gave this internal priesthood of the firstborn certain specific instructions. And we're going to see that these certain specific instructions that he gave to the internal priesthood of the firstborn were different than he gave to the internal Levitical order. Now, these two different sets of instructions, or these two different Torot, are still contained within the Torah, if we define the Torah as the first 5 books of Moses. Then we're also going to see that the internal Levitical order lasted until the days of Eli, and then it was with the days of Shemuel, we began to see established the beginnings of the Melchizedekian order. And we'll take a look at the Tabernacle of David, where the Melchizedekian order was set up. And then we're going to talk, it gets a little murky. But then Brother Judah goes into Babylon, and this is where the Levitical order gets corrupted. Now we begin to see what's called the rabbinical order. Or they don't call it that, but that's what I call it, because that's basically what it is. It's an order of rabbis. Then in the first century, with the days of Yeshua, we began to see what we might call an internal Melchizedekian order. We might also call it a hybrid Melchizedekian order. And what we're going to see also is that in the future, there will be a merging of the remnant of the Levitical order and the Melchizedekian order. There won't be many of the rabbis left after Armageddon, and then the Melchizedekian order will merge into the remains of the Levitical order. So in Exodus chapter 12, we saw the first Passover, and we saw Yahweh sent the death messenger, or the death angel, to slay all the firstborn of Egypt. At the same time, Yahweh took all the firstborn of Israel unto himself, and they would live a living sacrifice unto Yahweh. So in Exodus chapter 13 and verse 2, Yahweh said, "Set apart to me all the firstborn." They're going to make a living sacrifice. "Whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and beast, it is mine." So And then they were given certain specific instructions regarding the feasts. And there weren't that many instructions because what Yahweh really wanted was he wanted them to hear and obey his voice. And in fact, let's look at the next slide. That's what it says. So Yahweh's instructions to the firstborn priesthood in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 5, he says, and this is what he said when they first came out of Egypt. He says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, spiritual component, and keep my covenant, a legal component, or we might call it a specifics component. We might call it the written Torah. So if you will indeed obey my voice, meaning obey the voice of the Spirit, and also keep the commandments of the Spirit, then both those things, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all the people, for all the earth is mine. Now notice, if we can't hear his voice, how are we going to obey his voice? So that's what we're trying to show in this week's lesson, is just how important is it that we listen for his voice so we can hear his voice, so we can obey his voice, because this is what he wants. This is one of the two things that it takes to be a special treasure to him above all people. First, we have to obey his voice because his voice comes directly from the Spirit. We also need to keep his covenant. We're going to see this show up again later on in Jeremiah. He's going to paraphrase it slightly, but it's the same thing. Now, it's very important to obey the specifics of the Torah. Yahweh gives his commandments, his judgments, his statutes, his ordinances, and we need to obey those things. But in the bigger picture perspective, and this is what our Orthodox brethren miss, and so consequently, this is what our Messianic Jewish brethren miss, and this is also what most Ephraimites and most two-house believers miss. What's really happening here is Yahweh is a loving father, and he's attempting to raise up his children. In all of these things, he's being very strict. He's saying, this is what I want you to do, and this is what I don't want you to do, and I mean it. And if you're going to do that, there's going to be serious punishment, even death. But in all of these things, what he's really saying is, son, I love you. Now, I'm going to try to help you, okay? I understand we're talking about adopted children because Yahweh adopted us as his own. He took pity on us. He took mercy on us. And he's saying, I know you've had a tough time. I know you were raised in Egypt. Okay, I get all that. But if you're going to listen for my voice, okay, and I'm not always going to talk loud. Sometimes it's going to be a small, kind of a still voice. It's going to be hard to hear. All right? Sometimes I'm going to call to you from across the field, and you're going to have to listen hard for my voice. You're going to have to listen for me all the time. But if you hear my voice and you do the things that I tell you to do, you're going to have trials. You're going to get tested. But eventually, everything's going to work out all right. Everything's going to be okay. Just listen for my voice. And in certain sense, listening for his voice is even more important than the written Torah, because how did we get the written Torah? The written Torah was originally that someone wrote down the words of the Spirit. So that's the big picture context of this thing. Now, of course, we didn't do it. Our ancestors messed it up. Now, all we had to do was listen for his voice and obey his voice and obey the things he told us to do. But the people said, our ancestors said, Moses, he's been gone too long and we're scared and we want something to worship. So Aharon or Aaron says, okay, so break off all your golden earrings and give them to me. So Aharon received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molten calf. So that major fail. So then they said, this is your Elohim, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And when Aharon saw it, he built an altar before it. Epic fail. And Aharon made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to Yahweh. Epic fail. And then Yahweh spoke to Moshe and said, go, get down. The people whom you brought out of Egypt have corrupted themselves. Verse 25. And when Moshe saw that the people were unrestrained, For Aharon had not restrained them, he'd not corrected them, he'd not rebuked them, to their shame among their enemies. Then Moshe stood in the entrance of the camp and said, "Whoever is on Yahweh's side, come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together to him. So what happens quite often is that most people want a broad, easy road to follow. They want to heap up teachers for themselves, tickling the ear. But if you're going to be a true minister of Yahweh, there are times when you're going to have to resist the people. You're going to have to rebuke the people. You're going to have to tell the people, no, that is not right. That is not what Yahweh's word says. But the firstborn priesthood didn't do that, so Yahweh then commissioned the Levitical order to carry on in place of the firstborn priesthood. Now, an important thing to notice, for those of you who believe there's one and only one Torah, okay, what we need to see here is that the details of the Torah can change from priesthood to priesthood, and yet it's still all the same Torah because it's still all Yahweh's instruction. Yahweh is still attempting to set up Yeshua's ordered kingdom. That's what he's really trying to do. It's just different phases of the operation. Just as if you might give different instructions to a 6-year-old as you give to a 16-year-old. You give different instructions to a 7-year-old than you give to a 27-year-old. Okay, notice in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 5, Shemot 12 and verse 5. Now this is before the firstborn priesthood was initiated. But Yahweh says, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats." Cattle are not mentioned. Then in the Levitical Torah, in Devarim or Deuteronomy 16 and verse 2, Yahweh says, "Therefore you shall sacrifice the Pesach, or Passover, to Yahweh your Elohim from the flock and the herd, in the place where Yahweh chooses to place his name. Sheep and goats, those pertain to the flock. The herd, that term in Hebrew is bakar, that refers to cattle." Now, the thing we need to know about the Levitical Torah has many more specific instructions, okay, or Torot. So there's many more Torot. You have different Torot inside the Levitical Torah. You have the instructions to the Nazirite, the Torah of the Nazirite. You have the instructions regarding a jealous husband, the Torah of the jealous husband. But these are all part of the Levitical Torah. And the Levitical Torah, the Torah of the firstborn, these are all part of the Torah of Moses, or what's called the Torah, or the first 5 books of Moses. In a sense, it's almost a misnomer. Okay, and then once again, but we have inherited the term from our Orthodox brethren. But one thing to notice is that even though the specifics of the Passover offering changed in between Exodus, the first Passover, and the Passover instructions in Deuteronomy, the precepts are the same. So the precept is still what you're still trying to do. You're still trying to do the same thing. It's just now that cattle are a possibility because the families are bigger or whatever, for whatever reason. Now you can also use cattle. But what we're still trying to do, okay, now the Levitical Torah is for when we have a cleansed Levitical priesthood, which we don't right now. We want to unify the nation around a physical sacrificial altar. Right now, we do not have a cleansed Levitical priesthood, and the Torah is not our constitution in any nation of the globe, no matter what the Orthodox might say. And so, therefore, the Levitical order is not cleansed. Now, they're planning on building a coming third temple, and that will not be a cleansed temple, and it will not be a cleansed priesthood because they're going to have modifications of Yahweh's instructions. And we'll talk more about that later. But what we need to see here is the Levitical priesthood lasted until 1 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 10, and that's when it became defiled. So in 1 Samuel, or Shemuel Aleph, chapter 4 and verse 10, so the Philistines fought with Israel. Israel lost. There was a great slaughter of Israel, about 30,000 foot soldiers. That's a lot. And the Ark of Elohim was captured. Now, it's important to notice the Ark never returned to the Levitical tabernacle after that time. So what had to happen? Because the Levitical tabernacle had been defiled, Eli and his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they did the wrong thing. So the Levitical order had become defiled, and it never truly regained its correct status after that. So then in 2 Samuel, or Shemuel Bet, chapter 6 and verse 17, King David had established a new and different tabernacle called the Tabernacle of David. Now, this was not the Levitical tabernacle. Levitical tabernacle was defiled. This is the Tabernacle of David, as referred to in Acts chapter 15 and in other places. Now, notice in verse 17, they brought the ark of Yahweh and set it in its place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it. Then David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before Yahweh. But how could King David do that? King David was not a Levite. King David was of the tribe of Judah, just as Yeshua would later be of the tribe of Judah. Now, we have a special mini-series on this, on the Tabernacle of David, in Nazarene Scripture Studies, Volume 5, and I encourage everyone to check it out. It's a very important series. It has everything to say about the origins of the Nazarene Israel movement. But what happened, basically, is that Shemuel, or Samuel, received what might be called an internal Melchizedekian anointing. Then when the Levitical tabernacle was defiled, he was able to anoint King David, and then King David received this Melchizedekian anointing. And since King David was a prophet, he was then able to officiate in the Melchizedekian tabernacle. So there we are. King David then, in turn, is the ancestor of Yeshua, and Yeshua is now our high priest in the heavens after the order of Melchizedek, as it says in Psalms 110 and verse 4, and also in the book of Hebrews. But what that doesn't mean, what a lot of people think, but it doesn't mean that Yeshua's body on earth has nothing to do. Yeshua's body has the mission to raise up and to establish and to extend Yeshua's global ordered kingdom into all nations, according to the Great Commission and the fivefold ministry. Now, this applies whenever we do not have a cleansed Levitical priesthood and do not have a cleansed Levitical altar. So right now, the rabbinical order, that is not a cleansed Levitical priesthood, no matter what they say. And this third temple will not be a cleansed Levitical altar also, again, no matter what they say. The next temple we're going to see is an anti-Messiah's temple, but there will be a fourth temple after that. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. But the purpose of the Melchizedekian order is to extend Yeshua's kingdom into all nations, according to, or by way of, the Great Commission and the fivefold ministry. And there's rules for this. We talk about those rules in Acts 15 order and also in Torah government. Very important studies. I encourage everyone to study them. But in Matthew, or Matityahu, chapter 28, starting in verse 19, so Yeshua had said, all authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. He says, go therefore and make disciples in all the nations, immersing them in my name. Now we talk about why we immerse in Yeshua's name only in the aptly named study, why we immerse in Yeshua's name only in Nazarene Scripture Studies, Volume 3. Again, you can read it on the website, you can download a PDF copy for free, or you can purchase a paperback copy on Amazon.com at our cost. But what Yeshua says is, go therefore and make disciples in all the nations, immersing them in my name, and teaching them to observe, or in Hebrew that word would be obey, teaching them to obey all things that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And that's effectively what a disciple is someone who does voluntarily, happily, joyfully, all things that Yeshua commands us. So a lot of people find Yeshua's commandments burdensome, but when you love someone, you're happy to spend your time. You're happy to spend your money on them. When you have a hobby, you're happy to spend your time and you're happy to spend your money. So is pleasing Yeshua our hobby? Are we happy to spend our time? Are we happy to spend our money at it? Is there anything else that we'd rather do? Or is the thing that we want most in life is to please our husband Yeshua after all that he's done for us? Take a look at people's daytime planners and take a look at their financial records. And you can tell what matters most to them because that's where they spend their free time. So where do we spend our free time? Well, when you find the people who spend their free time trying to do all that they can to help further Yeshua's ordered kingdom, typically speaking, that's a disciple. And that's what we're supposed to be raising up in the Melchizedekian order. And nothing else qualifies as a disciple, only that. Okay, but we know that the Levitical and the Melchizedekian orders will be merged after the ingathering, after Armageddon, as it says in Isaiah chapter 66, starting in verse 20. It says, "Then they shall bring all your brethren for an offering to Yahweh out of all nations," okay, where the Melchizedekian order has gone to raise up disciples in all nations. Okay? And then one day after Armageddon, in the ingathering, we will all come back on horses and in chariots, in litters, on mules and on camels, in trains, planes, automobiles, perhaps boats, who knows what. "To my set-apart mountain Jerusalem," says Yahweh, "as the children of Israel bring an offering in a clean vessel to the house of Yahweh. And I will also take some of them for priests and for Levites," says Yahweh. So what he's saying here is that those of the Melchizedekian order who come back to the land of Israel, they will be merged with the remains, with what's left of the Levitical order or the rabbinical order, which there's not going to be very many of them according to prophecy. But we will be merged again, and then the Torah will change again. Because right now, in the Melchizedekian order, we don't need a sacrificial altar because we're in the dispersion. But when we come back to the land of Israel, there will again be a sacrificial altar. And I realize that a lot of Christians' heads just melted down when I said that. But take a look. And once the Melchizedekian and the Levitical orders are merged, there will again be a temple in which to officiate, probably with the Levitical Torah. But notice, Ezekiel or Yechezkel, chapters 44 through 46, speaks of a temple that has not yet been built. We know it has not yet been built because the dimensions are very much different. Also, it speaks of a Nasi, or a prince. This is going to be a constitutional prince. He's going to be a hereditary ruler. He'll have Torah laws to obey, but he will be a hereditary leader. And Ezekiel chapter 45 and verse 22 tells us that there will again be a sacrificial altar. And it says, "And on that day, the Nasi, or the prince, shall prepare for himself and for all the people of the land a bull for a sin offering." And people say, well, that's Yeshua. And I say, how can that be Yeshua? Yeshua was the sinless and spotless lamb. Does Yeshua need to offer a sin offering for himself? Okay. So what we need to understand is that Yeshua is our high priest in the heavens. He expects us as his body to walk things out for him on earth. And there will once again be a Nasi, or a constitutional prince, ruling over the combined nation of Israel. We see that in Ezekiel chapter 45 and verse 22. We know that this is a human because he offers a sin offering for himself. That's something Yeshua is not going to do. So we're talking about the Torah and the testimony and the relationship between the Torah and the testimony so that we can understand the importance of hearing and obeying Yahweh's voice. That's next week. Take a look. King David wrote the Psalms. Most people believe that King David wrote the Psalms by the Spirit. So this is effectively the Spirit speaking these Psalms through King David as an empty vessel. So So in Psalms 119, which is oftentimes referred to as the Law Psalm or the Torah Psalm, Psalms 119, starting in verse 44, King David, speaking by the Spirit, says, "So I shall keep your Torah, or your law, continually, forever and ever." It says, and yet I will walk at liberty because I seek your precepts. So what is King David talking about here? What King David is saying is there will be times when you may have to break the letter of the Torah. Okay. Now that shouldn't happen often. And if you are going to break the letter of the Torah, you should know why you're doing it. And it should be, the only reason should be, is because the Spirit tells you to do so. You say, well, what do you mean by that? And this is what we need to talk about next week. We're coming into the end times. There's some very difficult situations ahead. So what we have to do is we have to remember the mission to establish Yeshua's ordered kingdom in all nations. And then if we're going to deviate from the letter of Torah, it needs to be only because that's what Yeshua's voice said to do. And we have to be careful. Satan also has a voice. And the way you can tell the difference is Yeshua's voice is still and small and kind and quiet and loving. Satan's voice is typically angry and pushing and agitated. It's in a hurry and these kinds of things. Okay. So this is the same thing the Apostle Shaul or Paul says in Galatians or Galatim, chapter 5 and verse 13. He says, "For you, brethren, have been called to liberty." He's saying you may not necessarily need to obey the letter of the Torah, of the Levitical Torah. Why? Because you're in the dispersion, because you're under the Melchizedekian order, because it's a prophetic order. We're supposed to be listening in the Spirit. But we shouldn't do this for evil. We should only do it for good. Our purpose is to establish Yeshua's global ordered kingdom. So he says, only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, serve one another, because that ultimately is how we raise up Yeshua's ordered kingdom. He says the same thing in different words in 2 Corinthians or Corinthian Bet, chapter 3 and verse 17. He says, "Now Yahweh is the Spirit. And where the Spirit of Yahweh is, there is liberty." Okay, so what he's saying is, when we're listening to the voice of the Spirit, then if it tells us to do something that's not in the letter of the Torah, the Spirit takes precedence. Because how did we get the letter of the Torah in the first place? In the first place, the Spirit told someone to write these words down, and that's how we got the letter of the Torah. So if the Spirit tells you, okay, in this particular case, I don't want you to do that. I want you to do this instead. It would be very much like if a loving father told his son, okay, son, now ordinarily I want you to do this and not deviate from it. But in this special particular case, I have special instructions for you right now. I want you to do this instead. And people say, well, can you give us an example of that, perhaps? Okay, well, the example that's oftentimes used is that of a traffic officer or police officer. So Elohim forbid that there should be a traffic accident, but they happen all the time. So when the police arrive and they show up and they start rerouting traffic, very often they're going to route traffic into the oncoming lane. And you're going to say, but I can't drive in the oncoming lane because that's breaking the law. Okay, no, you're breaking the rules of the road, but you're not breaking the law because you're being instructed to do something special by a higher authority. The only key is it has to be during a time when you are being instructed to do so by a higher authority. Because if you do so under your own authority, you could cause a fatal injury. So, this is the same kind of thing in Matthew or Matidyahu, chapter 12, starting in verse 3. Now, the Pharisees are hassling Yeshua because they're walking through the fields and the apostles are grabbing the grain and they're eating them as they go along. It's on the Sabbath day. And they say, "Why are your disciples harvesting on the Sabbath?" Okay, they weren't out there with a sickle and a basket reaping up all the grain. It wasn't a regular work day for them. Rather, they're walking through the field and they're just grabbing a snack as they go. So if you had a pomegranate tree and you snagged the pomegranate, you could eat the pomegranate or the figs or whatever as you walked along. That's not a big deal. That's not harvesting. And so Yeshua is trying to point out to them, they're not even understanding the Torah. They don't know what the Torah is. So he says to them, "Have you not read what King David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him. How he entered the house of Elohim and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, technically, nor for those who were with him, technically, but only for the priests." Okay, so what was the difference? The difference was King David was on a mission from Elohim. So because it ultimately served Elohim's purposes, because it ultimately would lead to the reign of the Messiah, it was not wrong to do so, even though it was technically against the written letter of the law. It was not wrong to do so because it was Yahweh's intent. So I left the army in 1989, and right about that time, they were just introducing the concept of what they called the commander's intent. And so war is a very difficult, confusing business, and you have an enemy that's shooting at you, trying to kill you. Communications are difficult, even in the best of times. Even in peacetime, communications are difficult. So things very often get confused. So they began a very good concept. What they began saying, they began providing the commander's intent. So in other words, if you're not able to capture that hilltop, or you're not able to take that railroad trestle, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to disrupt this shipment of reinforcements or whatever that's coming through this area. So if you're not able to do exactly what you were instructed, you're still able to do something to accomplish the overall purpose. And it's the same kind of a thing when we understand what is Elohim's intent, to establish a global ordered kingdom for his son. Then we can understand when it's a good time to deviate from the written letter of the Torah or not. I mean, we need to hear in the Spirit what the Spirit is saying to do. But if the Spirit tells us to do something that's in keeping with the establishment of the Messiah's ultimate global ordered kingdom, and it's a still small voice, then it's a voice we can trust. For another example, in Shemot or Exodus, chapter 23, starting at verse 14, this is one of the commandments given to the firstborn priesthood. Now notice it's similar to the commandments in the Levitical priesthood, although the details are different because the firstborn priesthood had less overall commandments. But Yahweh said, 3 times you shall keep a pilgrimage feast to me in the year. So that means under the firstborn priesthood, 3 times a year, everyone was to come up to the sacrificial altar and the nation was to be united. But notice in Melachim Aleph, or 1 Kings, chapter 17, starting in verse 4, the prophet Eliyahu, or Elijah, didn't do that. Why? Because Yahweh commanded him to go and stay in the Wadi Kerith, because there was a drought in the land. So why did Eliyahu, surely a prophet is going to keep the letter of the Torah, but not in this case, because he was answering to a higher authority. Another example is Hoshea. So if you are a Levitical priest, you are forbidden to marry a harlot. Yahweh is not big on harlotry. However, prophets are sometimes asked to do very strange things. So in Hoshea or Hosea, chapter 1, starting in verse 2, when Yahweh began to speak by Hoshea, Yahweh said to Hoshea, "Go, take yourself a wife of harlotry, and have children of harlotry. For the land has committed great harlotry by departing from Yahweh." So this was a sign to the nation of how they were playing the harlot against Yahweh. So that's why he had Hoshea play the harlot. So once again, This went against the normal specific instructions, but because Hoshea heard the Spirit's voice in his ear, he knew that this was something that he was supposed to do. So, finally, what we want to talk about is why so many people don't understand what the true definition of Torah is. And to put it frankly, it's because Brother Orthodox Judah doesn't understand what the Torah is, and your Messianic Jews take their understanding of Torah from Orthodox Judah. Also, you have your Ephraimites, your two-house movement people, your Messianic Israelites. They're also taking their definition of Torah literally from Orthodox Judah. So because Orthodox Judah doesn't know, Orthodox Judah has a veil over his eyes. Neither do the other groups that follow their lead know what it is. So how did that happen? Orthodox Judah, or you could say the house of Judah, went into the exile of Babylon around 597 BCE or 586 BCE, depending on whose numbers you're using. Now, there was no temple in Babylon, so there was no place for the people to bring their tithes, gifts, and offerings. According to Torah, without funding, no priesthood can long serve, so the Levitical order collapsed. Well, without spiritual leadership, the people would have begun assimilating into the Babylonian culture. So we don't know exactly how it happened, but I've had rabbis tell me that the rabbinical order got its start in the exile to Babylon. That's a quote. So, again, we don't know exactly how it happened, but what we do know is that at some point, the people stopped listening to what the Torah said, and they began following the traditions and teachings of the great men, or what's called the rabbis. In Hebrew, the word Rav means great. When you call someone Ravi or Rabbi, you're saying, my great one. That's why Yeshua says, but you be not called rabbi, because one is your rabbi. One is your great one in the heavens, and that's Yahweh. Okay. Well, here's a fun fact that's going to illustrate just how much Judah doesn't understand what the Torah is. Okay, so the term gematria, or gematria, tomato, refers to the fact that certain alphabets have numerical values attached to the letters. So Hebrew has gematria values, also ancient Greek has gematria values, Latin has gematria values. So we take the word Torah. So Tav, Vav, Resh, He. The letter Tav has a numerical value of 400. The letter Vav has a numerical value of 6. The letter Resh has a numerical value of 200, and the letter He has a numerical value of 5. We add all those up, we're going to come up with a gematria value of 611 for the word Torah. So now we take that fun fact to the Talmud. And if your head starts to hurt, it's because we're looking at the Talmud. Okay, apologize. But in the Talmud, we can begin to understand Judah's concept of legalism. Now, legalism is what you might call checklist salvation or checklist justification. In other words, we're not justified because Yahweh gave us unmerited favor, but we're justified because we do this list of commandments, things we're supposed to do, and we refrain from doing this list of commandments, things that we're not supposed to do. That's Judah's concept. It's rules-based. It has nothing to do with a loving father trying to raise up his children in the way they should go, so that when they're older, they shall not depart from it. It has to do with earning your salvation by doing all the things you're supposed to do and not doing all the things that you're not supposed to do. So it's very analytical, and something gets lost, something very, very critical and important, such as hearing Yahweh's voice and the testimony of Yeshua. Those get lost. Okay, so we come to Wikipedia and we type in 613 points of law. Because if you've been in the Messianic movement or you've been around two-house people, you've probably heard the term 613 points of law. What we find out is that this concept of 613 points of law is effectively a rabbinic myth. And not only that, It's a very confusing rabbinic myth. We're going to take a look at it. So we type into Wikipedia 613 points of law, and it says, the Talmud notes that the Hebrew numerical value, or gematria, of the word Torah is 611, like we just saw in the last slide. And combining Moses's 611 commandments, alleged 611 commandments, with the first two of the 10 commandments, which they say were the only ones heard directly from Elohim, which is completely false, adds up to 613. And they give a footnote, Babylonian Talmud, Makot 24a. Okay, now we're going to take severe issue with this because in the first place, they go through the Torah and they add up the positive and the negative commandments, and they don't come up with 611. You have to torture the Torah severely to get 611 commandments out of that. And for the second place, the 10 commandments, the first set of tables, were handed to Moshe by Elohim. So how can we say that Elohim only dictated the first two of the 10 commandments? And then Moshe is the one who dictated the rest? Okay, well, this happens to be the Orthodox Jewish concept. So we understand that Yahweh gave his Torah to Moshe, and Moshe then gave Yahweh's Torah to the rest of the people. And it was the Levitical priesthood's job also to teach Yahweh's Torah to the rest of the people. Well, that's what went out in the exile to Babylon, and they never came back to it. Okay. What Orthodox Judah teaches instead is that Yahweh gave Moshe the authority to set his own Torah in each generation. And so then Moshe eventually laid hands on Joshua. Joshua then laid hands on the judges. The judges eventually laid hands on the sages, and so on down the line until you got to the rabbis. So it's a myth very similar to the myth of papal succession. Same kind of a thing. They're just kind of at 90-degree angles to one another. But a very, very, very different, very wrong kind of a thing. So again, to suggest that the first two of the 10 commandments were the only ones heard directly from Elohim. No. Okay. So we come to the footnote at Babylonian Talmud Makot 24a. It actually begins in 23b. It continues on. It says, Rabbi Simlai, when preaching, said, 613 precepts were committed to Moses, 365 negative precepts corresponding to the number of solar days in the year. Excuse me? So this would have nothing to do with sun worship, and we're not looking at the celestial bodies and instead of ascribing things to what Yahweh said, we're not ascribing things to the sun, the moon, and the stars. That has nothing to do with that. Oh, no. Yes, it does. He says, and 248 positive precepts corresponding to the number of the members of a man's body. Okay, so we're not ascribing things to the motions of the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and stars, and we're not exalting the sun and the moon and the stars. We're not exalting men. We're not having certain numbers of commandments because we're lifting up the sun and because we're lifting up human beings. Oh, no. Yes, that's exactly what's happening. Okay, this was the opinion of Rabbi Simlai. He was a 3rd century CE rabbi. But the problem in Judaism is that with the new model since Babylon, when something is a tradition for 3 or 4 generations, it then takes on the weight of law. So if it is effectively written or codified into the Talmud, it is effectively codified into law. So even though this is a completely erroneous concept, and even though people go through the Torah and they can't come up, well, some of them do, but most people don't come up with 611 commandments. And yet this is written in the Talmud, so that's what they feel compelled that they have to do. And it continues. Said Rabbi Hamnuna, what is the authentic text for this? Good question. Yes, indeed. What is the authentic text for this? He says, it is Moses commanded us Torah, an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. No, excuse me. Yahweh commanded us Torah through Moshe. Yahweh commanded the Torah. And he says, Torah being in letter value or gematria equal to 611. Okay, so the letters Torah add up to 611. So what? He says, then we add I am, which is the first of the 10 commandments, and thou shalt have no other Elohim before my face, which is the second of the 10 commandments. And then the rest of the commandments are not being reckoned. So they figured that they heard the first two from the mouth of the divine. So because of this, they figured there must be 613 commandments by definition, which are ascribed to the Son and ascribed to men. So when you hear the phrase 613 commandments used, that's where it comes from. So what does Yahweh think about all this? Yirmiyahu, or Jeremiah, chapter 11, starting in verse 1. The word that came to Yirmiyahu, or Jeremiah, from Yahweh, saying, hear the words of this covenant, the covenant that Yahweh gave. Don't go thinking up your own things. Hear the words of this covenant and speak to the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and say to them, thus says Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, cursed is the man who does not obey the words of this covenant, which I commanded your fathers in the day I brought them out of the land of Egypt from the iron furnace, saying, obey my voice and do according to all that I command you. Actually, he said, and keep the words of this covenant. Okay? Yahweh is paraphrasing himself. That's because he's a loving father trying to instruct his children in what's important. But our brothers and sisters in Orthodox Judah aren't listening. He's saying, hear, obey my voice and do according to what I command you. Don't go making up your own rules. Don't go ascribing things to the motion of the sun, moon, and the stars. Don't say that things are because of the number of members of a man's body, but obey my voice. How can you obey Yahweh's voice if you can't hear it? We'll talk about that next week. He says, and do according to all that I command you. So what is the relationship? So how do we get the written Torah? The written Torah is because someone wrote down the words of the Spirit. The Spirit spoke and someone wrote them down. So this all boils down to hearing and obeying Yahweh's voice, whether heard in the ear form or whether we're obeying the written form. Everything comes from the Spirit. Everything emanates from Yahweh. And what Brother Judah has forgotten, and what Messianic Judah, and what the Ephraimites, and what the two-house community they've all forgotten, is this basic message from our loving Father who's trying to say to his children, I love you. I know you've been through a lot. What I want you to do is I want you to listen for my voice. If you love me, I want you to learn to listen to me. And when I tell you to do something, I need you to trust me and I need you to do it. And you're going to have trials and you're going to have challenges. You're going to have problems. But if you listen to me and trust me and do everything that I tell you to do, everything's going to be all right. But you've got to hear and obey my voice. So this is our teaching on the Torah and the testimony. And we're doing this as a preparation, as a part one for part two coming up next week. When we talk about the vital, quintessential importance of hearing and obeying Yahweh's voice. Please join us again for part two. Shalom.